In this video, you are going to watch a senior developer review a junior developer's code. Micha here has coded a basketball scorecard based on the design in Module 3 of the front-end developer career path. And now Guil, a senior developer previously at Treehouse, then Shopify, is going to review the code and show her how to take it from junior level code to something more efficient and polished. Code reviews normally happen in the workplace, but they are incredibly productive for new learner developers as well. This is because as a new developer, it's really hard to shake that feeling of like, okay, my code works, but could it be better somehow? Did I go about it in the right way? Getting a code review from a more experienced developer is a great way to accelerate your learning and almost absorb their experience as they apply their perspective to your code. That's why actually at Scrimba, we invite students like Micha here to implement these Figma designs we call solo projects and submit them for a code review. I'll be back at the very end of the video to explain how you could potentially get your code reviewed. But first, here's the actual code review with Guil and Micha. Let's get into it.
All right. Well, hey, Micha, it's great to see you. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Guil?
Fantastic. Yeah. So, Micha, I know you're one of our most prolific code reviewers. You do an awesome job reviewing projects for the community. So we had this awesome idea to bring you on and do a code review for the Scrimba community and students and folks out there, just to give them an idea of what to expect and how the code review process goes here in the Scrimba community, which usually happens on Discord for both the bootcamp and our pro level students. So you submitted a solo project over to me. And before we get into the code review and get further into the process, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the project and what the project was, what you felt went well, maybe some challenges you had and some questions you might have or things you want me to focus on in the code review.
So I finished the front-end developer career path a few months ago, and I recently started my first job as a developer, so that's exciting. But the career path has changed a little bit since I was doing it. A lot of solo projects have been added, and so I wanted to complete the projects myself. The one that I submitted most recently was the basketball scoreboard. It's super new, and it was really fun. So I think it went pretty smoothly. A couple of things I struggled with were learning how to import that font, the cursed timer font. And the other thing was that my code didn't end up being very dry. So I wanted to kind of figure out how to make my code more dry.
Thanks so much for giving me a little bit of insight into the project. The basketball scoreboard project is fairly new and it introduces some unique challenges. So I'm glad a lot of things went well. And those were a lot of great prompts for me to kind of go through and have a look at while reviewing your code. And just to make sure, as we code reviewers always do with students, just to make sure that we're not getting ahead of things or introducing too much in the review that they might not understand yet, or maybe perhaps it's something you haven't come across yet in your coding journey. Where are you in the front-end developer path? Just to make sure I keep my feedback more in line with that.
So I completed the career path at the end of March, but there are some new modules. So I actually have at least 2 or 3 modules that I haven't done that I'm kind of going back through. I think it's module 2, and then I did your awesome code reviews module and the next level JavaScript module. I think it's number 7 now. I started that and I want to work back through it because it works a lot with constructors and classes. So it'll be good for me to brush up on that.
Great. Fantastic. Yeah, great to hear. I see a lot of opportunities to give some feedback on how to make your code a little bit more optimized and succinct with things like event bubbling and delegations to help you write less functions, for example. So great. Yeah, this is a lot of good information that I can take as I move into the code review. Thanks so much, Micha. All right, Micha. Well, thanks so much for sending over your basketball scoreboard solo project for review. I just opened it up and started using it and testing it. And I must say that I really liked the highlight sort of box shadow you added around the high score. Well done there. I can test that everything works as expected. I click new game and everything resets to 0. And for this review, I'm not going to comment too much on the HTML or the CSS. I see that you're using Flexbox here quite effectively. So we are going to focus on your JavaScript, which from speaking with you earlier is what you want to focus on for this review. So overall, you mentioned that you felt like the code wasn't as dry as it could be, and that perhaps you may have written too many functions for the same sort of functionality, right? Like to update a home score or to update a guest score. And yeah, I would totally agree. By looking at index.js, I see a lot of opportunity to optimize and reduce your event listeners and really make your overall JavaScript more efficient with a technique called event delegation or event bubbling, which we'll get to in just a bit. Now, from speaking with you, I know that you completed Scrimba's front-end developer career path, so that sort of ensures that I won't be getting too ahead of things when it comes to the feedback I'm giving you. So that's great. I think you might grasp some of these concepts really well. So let's dive in. First up, what I'm seeing here is that you are targeting all 6 buttons on the page for home and guests, for example, via the ID. So here we have these parent section elements, and within that a buttons div, and each buttons div has the 3 buttons for home and guests. And then over in JavaScript land, you are adding an event listener to all 6 buttons. So for example, this one updates the home score by 1, 2, 3, and then again, the guest score by 1, 2, 3, and so on. And that works great. It's super effective, as we can see here. But as I mentioned, I do see an opportunity here to utilize a technique in JavaScript that's fairly common called event delegation or event bubbling. So the idea is that instead of selecting all the buttons you might have on the page and attaching a click event listener on them that then updates the score and adds the highlight class, for example, you target one element, which is the parent of a button, for example, and then determine what should happen when a child of that element is clicked. So in this case, you'll minimize your JavaScript from having 6 event listeners on a button to maybe 1, depending on how you approach it. So first, what I might do is get rid of all these button variables, and instead I'll target the button's common ancestor and put an event listener on that, which in this case, we can see that it's this main element with the class container. So here I'll declare a variable named container and target it with document.querySelector, let's say. And then I'm going to go ahead and select and delete all of these event listeners here, because now we can put the event listener on our container. And we want to listen for a click event. I'll pass in the callback function as well. And the callback function of an event listener accepts a parameter, which is the event object. You'll often see it as event or E. And that event object gives us lots of handy information that we can use. So for example, if I console.log e.target and click on one of the buttons, for example, we can see that it's returning as the target the actual button that was clicked. So now we can use JavaScript to say, okay, well, if the button inside the container that was clicked is the button that updates the score by 1, then update the score by 1. If it's guest, update it by 1, 2, 3, and so on. And there are many ways we might do that to specifically determine what button was clicked and then what might happen after that. For example, you can check the button's class, maybe its ID, its value. So what we'll do is use a custom HTML data attribute on the button element. And data attributes let you store additional information about the element. For example, the value to update the home score by or the guest score. So the first thing I'll do, since we're no longer targeting each of the buttons individually, I suggest getting rid of the IDs. Now on the first home score button, I'll include a data attribute, which usually start with data dash, then a custom name. So in this case, it can be dash home dash points. And since this button updates the score by 1, I'll set it to the value 1, and I'll update the other home buttons to use a data attribute. And this value will be 2, then 3. And for the guest button, we'll say data dash guest dash points. This button will update the points by 1, then 2, and 3. All right, so now these data attributes provide a lot of useful information we can use in our JavaScript. And the way you read data attributes in JavaScript is using a property called dataset. So for example, let's log the data attribute of a button that's clicked. And to test it, we'll call it on the target using e.target. And remember, in this case, the target is whatever element triggered this event, which is click. So we'll say e.target dot dataset followed by dot and then the name of the property. And you need to write it in camel case because that's how JavaScript works. But here, home points is indeed referring to this attribute here. So let's see what that returns. I'll click one of the home buttons like 1, for example, that returns the string 1. Good. 2 returns 2 and 3 returns 3. Perfect. So first what I can do here is assign the target to a variable because we're going to use it quite a bit here. So I'll call it target and say e.target. And now using the target, let's also store the value of a data attribute based on which button was clicked. Let's start with home, for example. So we'll say const home points, and we'll read the data attribute of whatever home points button was clicked. Remember, with the dataset property and the name of the property, which in this case, it's home points. And we'll do the same with guest. I'll name this variable guest points, and we'll read its data attribute with target.dataset.guest points. All right, so now we can perform some helpful checks using if statements. For example, we can check if the target that was clicked has a data attribute of home points and it has a value, then let's update the home score. Or if the button that was clicked has a data attribute of guest points, then let's use that value to update the guest score. So first, let's do if home points. I'll first test the value of home points by logging it to the console. So let's see, if I click on a guest button, nothing happens. But if I click a home button, we see 1. And then if we click on the 2 button, we see 2, 3, and so on. Good. All right, so before we move on, I want to take a step back and sort of explain what's happening here with event delegation. Event delegation is a pattern that handles events quite efficiently. So what we did here, instead of adding an event listener to each and every button on the page, for example, we added an event listener to the parent container element, and then we're listening for the click event on multiple elements, right, using e.target. And it's all happening with one event handler versus 6. And the reason it's called event bubbling is because when an event happens on an element, it sort of bubbles up all the way to the parent or ancestor. So the event listener on the parent here sort of analyzes bubbled up events to find a match on a child element, then performs some action after that. It sort of delegates it. All right, so let's keep going. Let's update the score. So here in this if statement, so what we want to do here, for example, is update the home score by a button's data home points value. So whatever button was clicked, we'll read this attribute and the value and update this variable by that. So we'll reference the home score variable here and then use the addition assignment operator with plus equal to increase the home score by the value of home points. And I'll log home score to the console to test what it returns. And notice how the values are getting concatenated. So we see 0, 1, 2, 3, 1, instead of seeing a number value like 1, 2, or 3. And the reason that's happening is because currently the value of home points is a string, right? Each data home or data guest points attribute is set to a string. So we need to convert a string to a number. And a super handy tip, which is one of my favorite JavaScript tips for doing that, is using the unary plus operator. And it looks like this, a plus sign immediately in front of the variable holding a string or the string itself. So now if we test it, we can see 1, then 3, then 6, 9, and so on. Good. And this unary plus operator works very similar to like the parse int method or even the number object, for example. It all works in a similar way. Oftentimes the number object or a parse int method, for example, is more expressive than just having a plus sign here, which can be confusing, but that's what I like to use. So I'm going to stick with that here. So now the only thing that's left to do is to update the home display, right? Which is the points on the page. So to do that, I'll say home display.text content. And what do we want to set the content to? Well, the latest home score, which is stored in the home score variable. So now let's see, clicking 1 should hopefully update it by 1, and it does. Clicking 2 sets it to 3. Hopefully clicking 3 updates it to 6, and it does. And now we can apply the same sort of logic to the guest points. So I'll copy this if statement and update it to say if guest points. Let's update the guest score by the value of guest points. And here we'll say guest display dot text content equals guest score. Let's try that out. I'll click 1, good. This should say 3, 6, and so on. Perfect. All right, now what about the highlight functionality? Well, if you remember in your code, you were calling this highlight function in every event listener, but now you can simply call it once here in this event listener, and that should hopefully take care of it. Let's try it out. All right, so we have 9 points for home. Let's set guest to a score higher than 9, and good. Yeah, it switches over. Perfect. So as you can see, another advantage of event bubbling. All right, so let's move on to the highlight function, which is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But I'm thinking that there might be a way to condense it. Instead of having if, else if, and else statements, we can probably do it with 2 lines of code instead of 9 or 10, for example. So I'm seeing a great use of the class list property here to add and remove the class highlighter, for example. So what I'll do is copy a set here and delete everything else. Instead of adding and removing a class, there's a handy method in JavaScript called toggle. So in this case, it's going to toggle classes from the class list, like add and remove them from home display or guest display, depending on some condition. So this toggle method accepts a second argument, which is sort of a conditional that determines when this class, for example, gets applied to the class list. And it looks like this. So here we want to check if home score is greater than guest score. So we can do just that. Home score greater than guest score. And then for guest display, we might do the reverse. For example, home score less than guest score. So again, when this is true, the class highlighter will be applied to home display's class list. Otherwise, it gets removed. And in this case, if home score is less than guest score, so if guest score is higher, then it's going to apply the highlighter class to the guest display's class. Otherwise, remove it. And that should be it. So let's check it out. All right. So I'll click 3. Good. Now let's see. I'll add 3 points for guest and 9. It's a tie score, so we're not seeing a highlighter class, but good. It removed it from home. And if I click through again, it applies it to guest. Fantastic. So it's doing the trick, all with 2 lines of code. All right, so for the reset or new game functionality, I'm not seeing a whole lot here that I would change. I might, for example, move the variable to the top, and leaving it above the event listener is fine too. That's just my preference. What I'm seeing here is that you are resetting the home display and guest display's text content to 0. But that information is already stored here, right, in the home score and guest score variables. So what I would do to ensure that everything is working as expected and resetting correctly, I'll set it to the variables home score and guest score. And let's try it out. Home score is the leader, so it gets the highlighter class. And guest, I'm done playing. I'll click new game, and good. Everything resets as expected. Awesome. All right, Micha, so that is about it for your code review. Again, wonderful work. Hopefully you learned a few new things and that the suggestions about making your JavaScript more optimized and efficient is going to help you down the road in your developer journey. So I'm looking forward to hearing back from you and what you think about the code review, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much for watching the code review with Guil and Micha. I think we owe Micha a thanks for putting herself out there, so please show some support with a thumbs up here on the video. As I mentioned in the introduction, I want to explain a little bit about how you could potentially get your code reviewed as well. As you'd likely know, at Scrimba we have something called the front-end developer career path. It has a bunch of modules which take you from not knowing any code to being able to code at hopefully a higher level. And throughout this career path, we have a bunch of these solo projects like the basketball scoreboard. We give you a Figma file and the UI design that's nicely polished, and we sort of expect that if you've watched the module and you understood it properly, you should be able to bring this project to life, and because it's your code, you can put it on your portfolio. It's a great way to test your understanding before moving on to the next module. Once you complete a solo project, you can head to the Scrimba Discord community and post it in the code reviews channel where a member of the community might review it. Or if you are a bootcamp subscriber, you'll get access to a dedicated channel where you are guaranteed a code review video. It won't be a YouTube video like this, it will be a scrim where the dedicated code reviewer sort of annotates and talks about your code and shows you all the ways in which it can be made more efficient, more robust, or maybe just more terse and nice to read. It's a funny story because Micha actually was recently hired as a developer and she is actually now on the code reviewer team. So if you submit one of your solo projects for code review, it might be Micha who records a scrim explaining how you can improve it. Again, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe if you want to see more like this. To close things off, I want to hear from Micha about her experience with code reviews.
I really enjoy getting to do code reviews. I love coding and I love talking about coding, so it's a perfect fit for me. It's a great skill to have to be able to articulate how you solve problems and why you might write code a certain way. I've always thought that you can reinforce your own knowledge and learning whenever you explain it to somebody else. So it's great for that. But as well, just looking at other people's code, you can learn so much. I might have written code for a project one way, but I see how somebody else did it differently and it works just as well or better. And so it's really cool. It's like I can add that tool to my kit for future projects. So that's awesome. I definitely think you should reach out and have somebody review your code. You'll get praise, which everyone loves, but you also might have somebody help you get past something that you're blocked on, or just learn new approaches for how to approach certain coding challenges. I also think you should offer to review somebody else's code because you will reinforce your own knowledge by explaining it to somebody else, and you'll get better and better at being able to talk about how you solve problems.